and doubtless it's the birthday of a great many other people to boot, Brexiteer and Remainer alike. And yes, I cannot name them all, I'm afraid. I'm grateful to the work with Don Barry, but I'm afraid my memory is not that good. And my knowledge is not that great. It's been a good try. Right, okay, we come now to the adjournment, the whip to move. Thank you. The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mr. Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry that anybody's leaving because we are now about to discuss the government's top domestic priority, which is of far more concern to many people up and down the country than the endless talk we've had of Brexit. I have entitled this adjournment debate Housing because I didn't want to be confined in any specific part of the housing debate, and I wanted to give the Minister the opportunity to address any question within this space, within the housing space as well. What's absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker, is that in relation to housing, we have a problem. We have a very big problem and have had a very big problem for some years. I have been attending seminars, roundtables and conferences on housing for at least 7 years. When I first went to the QE2 conference centre to hear Adrie Dijverstein, the godfather of the self-building custom house building movement in the Netherlands, a former Dutch Member of Parliament who then became the Mayor of Almere, a community in the Netherlands, which I think I'm right saying the Minister has visited. And since then I've been at many events of various kinds, and everyone has their own diagnosis of the problems and their own solution, but generally they all mention land or planning or finance. They often mention the role of the volume house builders, the way in which local council planning authorities are stretched, the difficulty in getting access to land. And many of these points have a great deal of truth about them. But it can be encapsulated, in my view, much more simply in the following sentence. The supply of housing does not rise to meet the demand for housing. In many other areas of life, it is true that the supply generally does rise to meet the demand. I suppose I'd call it orthodox rather than classical economics, if someone is making what economists call supernormal profits, that's to say profits that that are in excess of what one might expect, generally two factors combine to bring those profits down to normal levels. One is that other actors in the marketplace will see the opportunity of those high profits and will move in. In other words, new suppliers will move in with competition and increase choice for consumers and drive down the profit margins. But that's not the situation we have in the United Kingdom. In fact, over the last 30 years, the situation has become more and more steadily the reverse of that, so that we have effectively what are permanent supernormal profits. 30 years ago, in 1988, 66% of houses in this country were built by SME builders, a large fraction of the total, represented by excellent organisations like the Federation of Master Builders. The situation now is that less than 20%, perhaps 15 or 17% of houses are built by SME builders, with all kinds of extra problems to make it the more difficult for them to engage. And now a very small number of very large companies build most of the houses. The members of the Home Builders Federation, for the most part. The strange thing is that if you ask consumers what they think and what they want, and this has been done several times by independent, authoritative opinion pollster organisations which have been commissioned for the purpose, they will come up with the following result. Somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of people do not want to buy the product of volume house builders. The 75% number comes from an Ipsos Mori, a YouGov survey conducted by the National Custom and Self-Build Association, the trade body for, as the name suggests, self-building and custom house building, where houses are manufactured off-site, high-tech off-site construction is perhaps a better way of putting it, and then delivered to a site where they're constructed. That number comes, the 75% number comes from NAXPA. The 67% number, that's to say the 2/3 of people who don't want to buy the product of the volume house builders, or would prefer not to buy the product of the volume house builders, Mr. Speaker, comes from the volume house builders themselves. Their own research tells us that most people, Madam Deputy Speaker, do not want to buy their product. Now, in a vaguely competitive ecosystem where there was choice for consumers, then that would be corrected by new suppliers coming in and providing something that, that consumers did want. Let me be very clear that the numbers themselves suggest that between 1/3 and 1/4 of consumers do want to buy the product of volume house builders, and if they wish to do so, they should be free to do so, as long as they are built to the right standards in terms of health and safety and building regulations, and I have no issue with that at all. It is true that over the last 30 to 40 years, houses have got smaller and more expensive than they were in the not that distant past. But if people wish to buy the product of a volume house builder, they should certainly be free to do so, so long as those volume house builders operate within the law. And I don't object to that at all. But fundamentally, the two things you require, that one requires, Madam Deputy Speaker, in order for this ecosystem to function, is you need to have low barriers to entry and consumer choice. And those are the two things, fundamentally, that are absent. The consequence is, and I've tested this with 9-year-olds in primary schools in my constituency, what happens to the price of something if there isn't enough of it, I ask? And every hand goes up. They say, it goes up. And then just to make the point really clearly, I say, and what happens to the price of something if there's too much of it? And every hand goes up and they say, it goes down. It is not difficult to understand. It is intuitive to the point where a 9-year-old can grasp it. And that is what has happened to the housing market, if you can call it a market, in the UK. I suppose an economist might say, of course, it is a market, but it's a very, very oligopolistic market. In other words, there's something approaching, but not quite at monopoly. So what it means is that the suppliers, as I said earlier, making supernormal profits, can keep on doing this for a very long time without let or hindrance. At the same time, the average price of an average dwelling has gone from 3.5 to 4 times income a generation ago to about 8 times income now. That's depending on where you are in the country, of course. In South Norfolk, the last figures I saw from the National Housing Federation, admittedly slightly out of date now, but it won't have changed that much. We're about 8.2 times average income. At the same time, the numbers suggested 8.2 times average income in Harlow, in Essex. In Hertfordshire, it was 13 times average income. In Oxford, 17 times average income. And in some of the really hot boroughs in London, of course, completely off the charts. At the same time, in the poorer parts of the country where incomes are lower and properties are less desirable, even there, it is now 5.5 to 6 times average income in many cases. I pumped my parliamentary salary into one of those websites just to see what a lender would lend, and I was quite horrified that the first number that came out was 5.5 times income. That wouldn't have been possible a generation ago. So we've had more money chasing roughly the same amount of houses, and not surprisingly, the price has gone up. Now, there are a number of consequences for this. Yes, of course.
Thank the honourable member for giving me. Would he agree there that house builders also need to be looking at the cost of living throughout the time that residents would be owning the property, and meeting carbon reduction or zero carbon targets, so that when that house is sold, it actually changes the cost of living throughout the course of living in that house?
Yes, I would, Madam Deputy Speaker, although if you go on if one, not you, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure you don't need to go on a sales course, if one went on a sales course, one would be told benefits, not features. You don't explain that a vacuum cleaner does 3,000 revolutions a minute rather than 1,500. No one cares. You explain that it cleans your house better. And in the same light, I wouldn't bang on about carbon, making people feel kind of morally inferior. I would explain that you could have a choice to have a house that costs you nothing to heat. So why would you want one that costs so much to heat? I had this out very, very specifically at the Policy Exchange think tank with the Land Use and Planning Director, I think his name was, of Barrett, where I was asking about what they do for their customers. And I said, is it really true that you have a conversation with your customers where you say, now, madam, we've got a variety of houses available for you. This one over here that will cost you roughly £1,400 a year for heat and hot water. and this one over here that is insulated to at or near passive house standard, I will give away in a minute, is insulated to at or near passive house standard, that will cost you almost nothing to heat, perhaps with mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, maybe 80 or £100, £150 a year. Which one would Madam prefer? Do you really offer them that choice? And of course, he actually turned his back on me and stomped off rather than answer the question. I give way first to the lady and then to...
I thank the honourable member for giving way again. Would he agree, though, that we actually need a change in our building regulations, certainly in the building regulations of England and also Wales, where it's devolved, to make sure that housing is built to those low-carbon, zero-carbon standards to ensure that happens across the board? Because we do have house builders that are really taking advantage and putting up houses which are ridiculous cost to our climate.
Yes, I don't want to be building houses that in 30 or 40 years' time we will be knocking down because they're so dreadful. It is utterly pointless. She mentioned building regulations. I was addressing the Local Authority Building Control Conference, LABC, and you only have to say the word persimmon and they fall around laughing as if I'm as funny as Tommy Cooper, because they know, and Madam Deputy Speaker, they'll probably think people think I am as funny as Tommy Cooper, but the truth is that they are a byword for poor practice in the building industry. I have heard the chief executives of volume house builders criticise persimmon for their bad practice. And of course, we all know what happened to the sainted Jeff Fairbairn, who was being paid because of the particular compensation scheme he had. I'll say this slowly, Madam Deputy Speaker, £130 million in emoluments by the shareholders of Persimmon. So egregious a scandal was it that he got so sick of being followed around by the BBC with a microphone asking him to justify it that he eventually resigned, which was obviously a red letter day for many of us who are campaigning on higher quality. That is money that should have been going in a competitive environment where they couldn't afford to pay one chief executive that much money into larger spaces, better quality materials and better thermal performance. So there's a huge distortion. I give way.
Giving way, and first of all, can I congratulate the honourable gentleman from South Norfolk for bringing this forward. Him and I have discussed on a number of occasions about how houses should be built in the future. Modern house building should ensure better air quality, better insulation, better heating, better windows, better doors. It's all part of a modern house, but it's also about the location that it's in. It's about green areas around the house, it's about access to shops and all. A house has to be a home. Does the honourable gentleman, and I should have declared an interest, apologies for not doing it, as chair of the APPG on healthy homes and buildings. So that's a discussion that the honourable gentleman and I have had before. I know he has read the report and the inquiry that we did through that APPG. I know he's aware of the recommendations, and I also know that the Minister is aware of the recommendations. Does he feel that's the way forward for housing for the future?
I do, and I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for reminding me of it. It's very clear, there's a lot of evidence that if people live in better, more spacious, healthier homes, then there are lower costs for the NHS, there are lower sickness rates, it's better for employers, there are lots of other ancillary benefits of having better homes, as well, of course, that they're good in themselves. I'm keeping a close eye on the clock, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I plan to have a bit of a preamble, which I seem to be doing without too much trouble, and then get into the specifics of some things I want to say to the Minister about the Right to Build task force. But I'll say one or two more things before moving into the specifics of the Right to Build task force. The situation we now face is one in which an entire generation have basically given up on the chance of either owning a property or even being able to afford to rent a property. When it's costing you over 50% of your net monthly salary to rent a ghastly little bedsit where the mattress is hanging over the sink, and I only exaggerate slightly, in fact I don't exaggerate, I saw such an example on a Channel 4 documentary a while ago, but generally people pay, especially in the big cities like London, Birmingham and Manchester, an absurd proportion of their income. Then we obviously have a big problem. I was at a dinner at the London School of Economics where the professor was talking about a graduate student of his about to go and start working in the Bank of England on a not inconsiderable salary, but he was going to be living at home with his mum. The chap from KPMG round the table at this dinner then said, well, that's nothing. We start our graduates on $45,000 and they can't afford to buy anywhere. And then the chap from BlackRock said, well, that's nothing. We start our graduates on $75,000 and they can't afford to buy anywhere, certainly not within a decent distance of the office where we work. It's got completely out of sync. and the government has to fix it. There is, of course, a political problem to this for our own party, and I perhaps will address that at the end. But it's perfectly obvious, Madam Deputy Speaker, that if people can't get somewhere to live at a price they can afford, then they're not going to vote for a party that can't provide that for them. And we need a fundamental change. We've dug ourselves a big hole over the last 20 to 25 years, and it will take us 20 to 25 years to dig ourselves out of the hole. But if we're not careful, in 20 to 25 years, we'll be in the same position, only worse, unless we have the right policy proposals for fixing it. And that's really what I want to come on to now. When I came off the Public Accounts Committee in 2017, it was to spend time on the Right to Build Task Force, an initiative set up by the National Custom and Self-Build Association in order to help people, local councils, developers, community groups, landowners who want to bring forward self-build and custom house building projects on service plots of land, that's to say where all the difficult bits like the fresh water, sewage, electricity, broadband and so on are already dealt with, in order to increase supply and to give people more choice. And that's really what I've spent most of the last 2 years in this place doing. I will, but this is the last time I'll give way.
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman. In Cheltenham, we have a situation where the overwhelming majority of the house building that is taking place in the town centre is for retirement apartments. And does he agree with me that if you want to maintain the culture, the vitality and the vibrancy, you've got to ensure that young people can afford to live there as well? And would he therefore join me in congratulating the government for funding, through the Home Improvement Fund, millions of pounds for a Portland Place development in Cheltenham, which subsidises marginal viability schemes to ensure those young people can truly live in the town centre, contributing to its vibrancy?
Yes, I do, although I could easily get into a long discussion about viability that would consume the rest of this debate, which I can't do. There are big problems with the whole concept of the way we calculate viability. But I do congratulate the government in helping Cheltenham bring forward what sounds like a very important scheme. The Right to Build Task Force has been going for 2 years. We have scraped together £300,000, courtesy of the Nationwide Building Society's charitable foundation, Nationwide Foundation. Over 50 organisations have been helped. 60% of those are local councils, with the rest being community groups, landowners and developers. There are a whole range of examples of its work. Aylesbury Woodlands in Buckinghamshire is going to have a project where 15% of all the new homes will be for custom and self-build. Cornwall has an ambition to bring forward up to 1,000 service plots across the county. I'm looking for the member for North Cornwall, who arranged the meeting we had with the Prime Minister on this very subject, who is a passionate believer in more service plots. Northamptonshire has a plan where as many as 10% of homes could be custom and self-built across several different local authorities. There are rural areas such as Eden in Cumbria, which is looking at a range of opportunities for affordable homes for local people. Kings Lynn and South Norfolk, in my own county of Norfolk, has agreed an action plan to drive up delivery across the area with landowners and smaller builders. There is a lot that's going on already. The thing is, there could be very much more going on. The fundamental point, and actually this is a quote from Andrew Bagley-Chappell, who is a former director of Nationwide Building Society and who is now also the chief executive of the NAXPA, as well as still chairing the Bank of England Residential Property Forum. He said this: "Custom and self-build can deliver more and better homes that more people aspire to live in and that communities are happier to see built." An exegesis of that would cover basically most of what I want to say. If we want more homes, we've got to build them in a way that people want. At the moment, the problem is that most local people, feel they have no say, no voice in what gets built, where it gets built, what it looks like, how it performs in terms of thermal performance and therefore what it costs to run, and absolutely crucially, who gets the chance to live there. If you change all that, you change the conversation. As the member for Leeds North, Hilary Benn, the former shadow, thank you, said, we need to turn NIMBYs into YIMBYs. Prince Charles has put it even better when His Royal Highness referred to BIMBYs, beauty in my backyard. And we do need to create an environment in which people actually welcome housing. We've actually had the tipping point now where more people want it than don't, because people have begun to realise how serious the crisis is. I've got, as the Minister would expect, a small number of specific asks. The first is that we should have more government support for the task force. We've already had some. I persuaded the member for Bromsgrove, when he was the Secretary of State, to lend us a civil servant, a qualified planner and career civil servant. He would prefer me not to mention his name, but I will, because we are so indebted to him. His name's Mario Wolf, and he directs the work of the task force, and we're very grateful for the loan of Mario Wolf from the Ministry of Housing, and he's done an enormous amount with very little in the way of resources. I referred to some of the work earlier. And of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's true that if we had more, we could do more. The Help to Buy programme, which I'll come on to the moment, has so far spent £10.6 billion. And by 2021 we'll have spent, so it's planned, £22 billion. In other words, 35,000 times more on subsidising demand than on a scheme to subsidise supply, albeit indirectly, by helping to facilitate and increase choice for consumers. Except, of course, the government isn't actually paying for it. Nationwide, Building Society is paying for it, and I hope to have a discussion about that with the Minister at some point, because, of course, we are implementing government policy. If you read the Housing and White Paper, we're implementing government policy. If you read the Homes England strategy, it's very clear that the strategy calls for diversification of housing. The second thing I'd like the Minister to consider is to review the planning guidance on custom and self-build housing. That's to say the guidance which supports the revised National Planning Policy Framework, because at the moment it's outdated. There are three things that need urgent attention. First, on land allocation, many councils do not even know if they are allowed to allocate land specifically for custom and self-build housing, even though they are, and councils such as Bristol City Council are already doing so. We need clarity about what counts. We need there are some local authorities who are gaming the system. Local authorities, in some cases, are not clear what counts towards their legal obligations to provide permissioned plots of land. Some councils are allowing the conversion of holiday lets into private dwellings under the happy delusion that that counts towards meeting their legal obligations under the right to build legislation, and some of them may be in for a rude awakening at some point. The third point is about viability. While one is going to have to one is going to have, for so long as one has viability assessments, then I think the government needs to look carefully at how they should work in relation to custom and self-build, because it won't necessarily be the same as for market housing. And I'd be very grateful if the Minister would engage with the task force on updating the guidance generally so that it's more fit for purpose. My third request is about the planning inspectorate. It's absolutely imperative that government planning inspectors properly apply the current provisions of the legislation, where they determine planning appeals and where they examine local plans. There's clear evidence this isn't happening as it should. Mostly this is because planning inspectors are unfamiliar with the law in this area, which is still quite new, and the obvious answer is to have training for inspectors. Indeed, the Secretary of State has agreed with me at that dispatch box that we should do that. It hasn't happened yet, but I would urge the Minister to pursue this and to engage with the task force in identifying exactly what training is required. We need something to help raise consumer awareness. Most people would like to commission a project of their own at some point in their lives. There are 1 million people who would like to do it within the next 12 months, and yet only 12 to 15,000 do. And the reason for that, quite simply, is because it's very, very difficult to get a service plot of land. If it were as easy to get a service plot of land as it is to go into a Ford dealership and buy a Ford Fiesta, then far more people would do it. We are spending a significant amount of public money on housing, but at the moment I'm not convinced that we're not simply making the problem worse. Help to Buy is going to have spent £22 billion by 2021, helping 360,000 households. If you divide one by the other, you get £61,111. That's per household. I think we should be spending that better. At the moment, we're propping up an oligopoly that is performing well financially for itself, with some horrible results, while making itself very unpopular with the consumers who can't afford its products, and restraining. I won't, because I'm sorry, but only because of the lack of time. I do need to leave the Minister a couple of seconds. What was it Adam Smith said? People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. The aim for public expenditure on housing should be to lower barriers to entry and to increase choice so that people can have the houses that they want. If we get this right, we can transform, in fact, engender a revolution in this country in how housing is done. If we get it wrong, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will pay a very high price at the ballot box, because between the age of 20 and 40, there's almost nobody who can easily, at a price that a normal person can afford, dream of having their own place, even though 86% of people in this country want to. We need to design and redesign a system that allows them and everyone to achieve their aspirations.
Minister, Mr. Kit Malthouse.
Madam Deputy Speaker, that was a remarkable example, I have to say, of a combination of encyclopedic knowledge and conviction about what the honourable gentleman rightly points out should be not only the government's top domestic priority, but the entire country's primary moral mission, which is to build the homes that the next generation needs, and which are currently, as he quite rightly points out, denied to them. It's unusual for me to hear strains of my own speeches read back to me, and I know he hasn't been to listen to many of my speeches, but it resonates very strongly with me, because many of the themes he laid out in his preamble, in his diagnosis, I am myself going around the country promoting, not least the dysfunctionality of the house building market. And the one element, of course, which he admitted, but which I'm sure he's aware of, is it's not helped by the fact that in the crash of 2007-8, 50% of all small house builders were wiped out, removed from the market, having produced, as he said, over half of all new homes, now dropping, I think, to something like a third of all new homes. Now, the government, both in coalition and since, has done its best to try and push output up from 124,000 at the low of 2012 to 222,000 last year, and the forward indicators for next year are looking pretty good as well. Yes.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Would he answer why the government scrapped making homes all carbon neutral and scrapped those policies, when actually that would go a long way in, as was discussed earlier, helping living costs, helping budget, but also meeting climate targets?
So I totally acknowledge the role that high environmental standards have to play in a sense of social justice about housing. I went to a factory run by Accord Housing, where they're producing 1,000 homes a year out of the factory, modular homes. And so good are the environmental standards in those homes that they have lower arrears in those homes because people can afford to heat them. And this is definitely something on which I want to focus. But just in the short time that's left to me before the end of the debate, I just wanted to address some of the questions that he's raised. I mean, he is absolutely right that we need to do something about the way the house building market functions at the moment, and my job is to wander around being disruptive, supporting new entrants and new players to create the competitive landscape that he's looking for, competing on quality, type, being disruptive on technology, encouraging modern methods of construction, off-site manufacture, but also new techniques, so that new entrants find it easier to overcome those barriers to entry that he talked about, and disruptive on finance. And just a word before we finish on Help to Buy. I know he's perhaps a little negative about Help to Buy, but I would ask him to take care. There are many tens of thousands of young people who've accessed homes for the first time, to whom it was denied before because of a government-backed effective bank and mum and dad. And while there will be assessments of that scheme, there's no indication at the moment that it's pushed up prices.
Can you give way very briefly?
I just want to get on to your asks. But
of course, people who are given cash will be grateful. But if the architecture is wrong, if the fundamental problem is that there is a subsidy for demand rather than supply, we won't fundamentally solve the problem. Would it not be a good idea to wean people off Help to Buy and towards Help to Build, where we're subsidising supply? If you subsidise something, you get more of it, and what we need more of is supply.
Well, he's right, and it's possible. I know it's strange, but it's possible for government to do two things at the same time. Help to Buy affects a very, very small percentage of housing transactions, something like 4%. And the indications are that it hasn't had a particular impact on prices, but we continue to review the policy in the light of the success of that policy. Something like 160,000 people who've now accessed homes who otherwise wouldn't have done so. Now, just in the last minute or so, I just want to return to his questions. He asked 5 specific questions. First of all, will we look at review for the task force? Well, I'm more than happy to do so, and given that we're going to spending round, small amounts of money, though it may be in the scale of the spending training that I have, I'd be more than happy to do so. Planning guidance review, and in particular on land allocation, yes, of course, more than happy to look at that, and in particular to perhaps think about communicating more widely to local authorities, and I'd be happy to help with him to sponsor some kind of event to promote the idea and help local authorities to learn. On viability, when I was on the Treasury Select Committee as a backbencher, we did a housing inquiry in which I posed the question to Kate Barker and to David Orr, actually, as to whether we should do away with the viability test altogether as part of the planning system, and both of them thought that was a good idea. But in the meantime, we have standardised the viability test to see where we get to. On PINs, he's absolutely right. We're trying to talk to them about how they can be more consistent in their decision making and apply it more regularly across the country. And finally, on raising consumer awareness, I'd be more than happy to join him in doing so. Congratulate him on what has been a fantastic tour de force of his knowledge of housing policy.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.